All right, everybody, I guess we're going to get started. Feel free to move forward. There's some nice cushy chairs in the front row. I'll try not to spit. It'll be good. All right. So my name is Sarah Clatterbuck. I'm a web developer here at LinkedIn. And tonight I'm talking about stealth accessibility. I'm pretty sure I've violated some rules of visual contrast with this first screen, so hopefully everyone can see it all right. But why do I call this talk stealth accessibility? Basically, this is about how to get started and how to get traction kind of when you're at the very beginning, and some things that we've been learning over the past year. Oftentimes when you're in a new company or on a really big project, you're in sort of a startup mode, and your whole goal is to ship working software out to customers and get their hands on it, and then start iterating it. And typically in this phase, a lot of things fall through the cracks. One of these things is accessibility. I think other things that potentially fall through the cracks are reusability and performance, and a lot of topics that you tend to think about more as you mature in a project or in a company. And then also, most developers don't really seem to have this in their toolkit by default. So we all kind of come out of school or whatever trade we've been doing, and we understand a lot of things about writing code, but we often don't have any basis for understanding accessibility. I think the only discipline that potentially covers this a tiny bit is HCI. So perhaps if you're thinking about how your software interacts with people from different abilities. So how do I kind of define accessibility? I think it's kind of in two levels. One level is any piece of software that has a user interface, making it so that people of all physical and cognitive abilities can interact with that software. That's sort of basic accessibility in the way I think about it. And then there's sort of a higher order thing, which I like to call, or many people call, inclusive design. And that's basically thinking about what is the ideal user experience that would actually benefit everyone, not just sort of the optimized human, if you want to call it that. And so that's kind of how I think of accessibility in general. So just kind of a poll of the audience. How many of you are like, what's accessibility? I want to learn more. Okay. And how many of you have maybe a tiny bit of experience with this, but you don't feel super confident in the topic? Okay, and then anyone who's a ninja, intermediate, or advanced accessibility? I know you are. Cool. Well, I'll try to speak about things at different levels. This talk definitely comes from my point of view as a developer, so I'll be speaking to a lot of techniques and things as a developer. So a little bit about me. I lead web development for a division here at LinkedIn called Team Money. Team Money owns all of the mobile and web experiences that are monetized here. So essentially ads, job postings, company pages, subscriptions, payments, the recruiter portal, all of that is built by Team Money. And I also lead a upstart group called the Accessibility Task Force here at LinkedIn. We meet once a week, and we're working on a bunch of stuff that we'll talk about tonight. And yes, I do also write some code in my spare time. Actually, I have written a few features for the monetized products here, usually things that are patternizable that we want to use elsewhere on the site. And then I usually work on anything that falls into the category of a sort of rich internet application that might have more delicate accessibility concerns that I want to think about a little bit. So that's what I'm working on right now. So how did we get started? How can you get started in thinking about accessibility? I think there are three things that kind of build the foundation for this. The first is having a big tent approach to what we include when we talk about accessibility. The second is generating excitement both inside and outside of your organization for these types of initiatives. And then finally, actually picking some low-hanging fruit, finding some things where you can get some wins right off the bat and get some momentum going. So the big tent approach, a lot of times people start off talking about accessibility and talking about disabilities. And I really think that it's not just about disabled persons, that it's really much more nuanced than that. And there are a lot more people that are covered by these topics than you would normally think about. So for example, different learning styles could even be considered an accessibility initiative. So for me, I can learn really well looking at the written word, but then I have to focus a lot more if I'm listening to someone talk to actually receive information. So it's really helpful for me to have words to go with talking, or perhaps pictures to go with words, or other things to help me understand better. And so I can even think of that in terms of software as being an accessibility feature. You can also think of people who have only minimal professional proficiency in one of the languages you support in your software. So for example, you might be writing a website and you support English, Spanish, and Japanese, and you've got someone whose native language is Portuguese coming to the site. And maybe they're using the Spanish version and they're getting by with it, but they're missing a lot of the nuance in your site. And so you want to be able to provide interactions that support the words with visuals. And then I also think of aging and various issues related to aging. So on one end of the spectrum, you have very profound disabilities like complete loss of sight or complete loss of hearing or complete loss of mobility where you've lost a limb or something. But then on the other end of the spectrum, a lot of people are just getting into middle age and they have a slight loss of dexterity. Maybe they can't use a mouse as well as they used to, or they have carpal tunnel. Maybe they just have reduced vision or reduced hearing. And so those are things that I'm definitely thinking about in terms of our audience here at LinkedIn, because we're the professional network, and a lot of the most engaged, most accomplished professionals are now reaching a time in their life where they're going to be affected by these issues. Colorblindness is another good one that a lot of people are affected by, and we probably don't realize it. And so thinking about making features that don't just rely on color, but also rely on signals other than that. So a perfect example is a lot of dashboards you see, you'll have, red means bad and green means good. And sometimes they'll put them in a bubble and people can't distinguish the red bubble from the green bubble. And so maybe you can do something like having a check mark or a plus sign for green, and then, an X or a cross out sign for red. And that helps add meaning to that. And then finally, people who have injuries that are either temporary or permanent. I think about soldiers who've been in active duty and have lost an arm, or people who just break their arm. And a great example that I ran into with this was my then boyfriend, now husband, crashed on his bike and broke both of his wrists at the same time. And they actually casted him up above the elbow on both arms when he was in the hospital. And I go to visit him, and they've just placed a tray of food in front of him and walked away. And the guy can't get his hand to his mouth. And so I walk in, and he's got his chin up on the table, and he's trying to pick a grape off a bunch of grapes just with his mouth. So that's, a really good example of a temporary disability that with a corresponding accessibility problem. And I'm sure during that time he would have appreciated some enhancements to websites as well to make it easier. All right, so generating excitement. This is something that I've tried to do and I've also enlisted a lot of help with around the organization. So the first thing is giving talks like this, also internal talks. And sometimes these are just casual conversations. So I'll attend design sign-offs or developer office hours and then basically bring up accessibility issues into those conversations that we're having. Also, I put the Lamborghini up here because I once gave a talk to our whole UED organization about inclusive design, and I likened the experience of websites to different models of cars. And I was like, okay, your ideal human experiences the web sort of as an Audi. But if you have any sort of, aging-related disability or slight diminishment in your skills, maybe you're getting it as a Camry. And then if you have a profound disability, maybe it's a Yugo. And so we have a pretty big car culture in UED. And so then I put up the Lamborghini, and I was like, okay, what if everyone got an upgrade? What if everyone could experience the web as the Lamborghini? And that kind of helped generate some excitement around it. I like to invite guest speakers, and other people in the organization have invited guest speakers. So we've had Jennison Asuncion, who's an accessibility program manager for a big bank up in Canada. He's pretty well known, and he's actually come and demonstrated different parts of our site to us using a screen reader. We also had Victor Saran, who's the accessibility program manager at PayPal, talk to us about mobile accessibility. And these types of talks kind of help open everyone's eyes to the topics, but also help us to keep momentum going internally. I like to also highlight accessible and inclusive work when I see it in the organization. So basically, if I see a really great implementation where someone's done a lot of keyboard navigation implementation, or maybe the actual design was super inclusive, I like to just find opportunities for those people to show off their work for the rest of the organization. Inviting other people to hack. That's also a way that we've gotten people involved in this. So I did a whole Hack Day project around accessibility, which I'll show you guys in a bit, and invited some developers and designers to join me. And then we kind of built some excitement around that. And we've also done a few other hacks where accessibility wasn't the main point, but we incorporated those principles in. And then finally, blogging is a great way to generate excitement internally and externally. So I've done a few blog posts on my personal blog about different topics we've discussed here, and then distributed sort of my take on those topics internally. And then we also blogged for Global Accessibility Awareness Day about some of the things we were working on here in sort of the mode of here's what it does to help these different types of users. So we didn't talk a lot about technical implementation, but we talked about how it benefited different types of users. So the last step, and this is where the stealth really came in for us, and I think comes in for a lot of organizations, is picking low-hanging fruit. Basically, we wanted to look and see what are some easy wins that we can get and get some code committed to kind of start getting some traction. And this is very much behind the scenes, not a lot of fanfare, but just kind of doing some grunt work that's easy wins. So one example of this was basically we audited the whole code base for alt attributes on our images. How many of you are familiar with alt attributes? Okay, so it's basically like a text description of the images, and any images that we found that had no text description, we basically added one. And this was a very low risk change. We could basically divide this work up, and essentially we didn't have to do a lot of testing. We just had to basically look at the picture and describe it. So it's pretty straightforward, not very sexy, but a lot of good benefit for our users in that task. How many of you are familiar with the focus state in a browser and the focus outline? Okay, so I'll kind of describe what this is a little bit for you. But basically, when you are moving through a website from a keyboard, your cursor moves through the different elements that are focusable, which are anchors and buttons and various form elements. And in its native state, the browser will actually show you where you are by putting a nice little dotted outline around the thing that you're currently focused on, so you can see where you are in the page. But unfortunately, a lot of developers remove this outline, usually because a product manager or a designer goes, "Oh, that's so ugly, take that away." And so a great response for that is, well, what's an alternative thing that we can do to show where the user is at that place in the page other than the outline? So I can actually show you. So Yahoo Finance has a couple of nice examples of this. So you can see as I'm tabbing through, you can see where my cursor is. But that is just like a traditional focus outline around that home icon. But then as I move down, we have some more interesting focus indicators on this page where the background color actually deepens and you can see the menu is actually displayed. And so it gives you a good indication of where you are on the page without having necessarily that dotted line around everything. So for us, we basically had to change about 20 instances of this on our site. So one place that's pretty common that you might see is if you have a CSS reset. Unfortunately, a lot of the reset libraries will remove the focus outline by default from everything. And so you may not have even put that code in yourself and you've just inherited that. And so we looked and removed it from our focus, from our reset. And then we also found about 20 other instances, and we basically put the outline back or looked for an alternative display that we could give to indicate focus. So that was another low-hanging fruit. Another one is anchor tags that aren't really anchors. This is something we've been talking a lot about recently. So the anchor tag is really appropriate if you're going to be switching to another page, right? You're going to be changing the HTTP request to go to another page. Or if you're in a single page web app, you're going to do a hash change event, and then the view is going to reload and do something different. So that's an appropriate use of an anchor tag. But then you have all these other places where you've essentially got an anchor tag and it has no href, or the href is just pound, or it's JavaScript void. That's one we've seen quite a lot of. And all of those have problems that are kind of non-optimal. The first, if it's missing an href, then that basically removes the ability of the browser to put focus on that element. So if you remove the href, now any person that's using a keyboard to navigate can't get to that interaction. So that's pretty problematic. The pound, if you don't suppress the default event, will essentially scroll the page to the top. So that's kind of unfortunate for us here at LinkedIn because we have all these infinite scrolling things and somebody's way, way, way down, and then boom, they shoot up to the top of the page. And finally, the JavaScript void has potential security implications with the return value coming from that. So basically, we decided we should replace all of these things with buttons. So a button is actually a more semantic description for what's happening there. And so we haven't completely replaced all of these yet. We're kind of doing it on a go forward basis. And then anytime old code is opened up, we're trying to fix it. Radio button groups was another thing that we found could be optimized in the site. So I think probably most of you are familiar with all form inputs should have labels. Are you guys pretty familiar with that? And so with a radio button, the label is actually the text that appears next to the button. And so, for example, let's say I have radio buttons representing my security settings, and one is high, and one is medium, and one is low, and I've properly labeled everything. People with screen readers don't necessarily have context into what those things mean together as a group. And so what we've recommended is to actually use the field set and legend tags along with the radio buttons, so that basically we're saying these all go together. The legend says these are your privacy settings or these are your security settings. And then those labels have context. And again, we found maybe 10 or 15 places on the site where this could be optimized for our users, and we're in process of replacing those right now. And the last kind of low-hanging fruit we found was we do a lot of recommendation engines here at LinkedIn. You'll see them all over the site in different types of presentation formats, but typically it's like, here's some people you might know, or here's some companies you might want to follow. And then there's typically some sort of little X icon that represents dismissing one of the recommendations. And then when that goes away, a new one comes in. Well, we found that a lot of these actually use elements like span or div to have the little background image for the dismissal, and essentially not giving the full richness of that interaction to folks who are navigating with the keyboard because they couldn't focus on that element. And so we've been replacing those with buttons as well, where we find them. Or tab index. You can manipulate the tab index to allow non-focusable elements to be focusable. So I'll give you some examples of that later. So once we kind of got past the very beginnings of the beginning, we started to think about what's next for our accessibility initiatives. And so these are some things that we've taken as next steps. So taking the Hack Day project and turning it into an actual feature, getting feedback from our users to help improve the site, building a team of folks who can help do these things because many hands make light work, having a roadmap just so we understand where we're trying to go and how we're going to get there, and then tackling bigger problems iteratively. These are some things we've been doing. So hacks into features. The first hack that we have turned into a feature was actually this accessibility-related hack. We call it the Ally Jump Menu. It's very much inspired by an idea called table of contents that's been presented by a firm called Simply Accessible and some other folks in the industry. The idea is that if you have a really, really long page, which we do here at LinkedIn, we have very, very long pages, and you have somebody who's navigating with a keyboard, it takes a lot of tab stops to get way, way down the page. And so we wanted to basically give folks a way to kind of shortcut their way into other parts of the page. And so we built this hack. So when a user is navigating from the keyboard, they start with their cursor in the location bar, and then they typically start hitting tab. Oh. Oh, reload. So this is the jump menu feature. And you can see that after I hit tab and entered the page, this toolbar actually popped out. And then this will allow me to select from various landmarks on the page. And we actually use H2 and H3 tags as the chosen landmarks. And so let's say I want to go to that people you may know widget in the right rail, which would normally mean I've got to go down through all of the main content and then get myself up to the right rail. I can basically click on that, and now I've actually placed focus there on that headline, and then if I start tabbing, you'll see that now my cursor is over there in that part of the page. So I can continue on from there. How did we build this? We actually have a skip link at the beginning of our content. It basically allows users to jump to an anchor that's just below the navigation if it's not progressively enhanced. And then what we do with this tool is if JavaScript is enabled and we determine that it's a keyboard user because the user's actually placed focus onto that hidden link, then this whole interaction will kick off and basically we'll build the whole DOM for this menu, scrape all of the header elements, and then inject some landmarks with tab index that we can hook to in the page. So that's pretty much how the tool works. It has a lot of keyboard navigation and ARIA roles and such built in. If you're not familiar with ARIA, it's a web standard for accessible, rich internet applications. So definitely look up more info on that if you're curious. All right. So getting feedback from users, this has actually been super valuable in terms of developing our roadmap because we all came with sort of our own understanding of what might be optimized about our experience, but definitely hearing directly from users is pretty valuable. And so you noticed on the toolbar, we've introduced the accessibility feedback link on every page in the site. And so if users discover that, they write into us. And we actually have probably at least one person every day, if not multiple people, writing in with suggestions or comments on how we can make the experience better for them. We've actually also done video chats with several customers. We've done, like I mentioned with Jennison, we've actually watched him use parts of the site with a screen reader. We also talked to a blind user who was using our mobile app and actually watched him using it so we could understand what things might work better for him in terms of workflow and stuff like that. And then kind of getting out and meeting folks. We've I started attending the Bay Area Accessibility Dinners recently. It's organized by a guy named Ted Drake, who's doing accessibility over at Intuit. That's a great way to kind of meet and mingle with folks who are interested in this topic. And then also have been attending the accessibility bar camps. We went to the LA camp and then also to the CSUN conference, which is a pretty big conference for technology and people with disabilities, essentially. So great places to learn and meet people. So building a team, it became apparent to me pretty early on in stealth mode that having other people help with this sort of thing would be useful, just because I had a lot more stuff I wanted to do than I could actually do. And so we started a web dev accessibility task force here at LinkedIn. And like I mentioned before, we meet once a week. We have about 10 to 12 developers that are part of the task force. We're working a roadmap and we're doing it kind of sprint style where we all stand up and report on what we're working on. It's not really a sprint because it's only once a week, but we're getting stuff done that way. In terms of keeping momentum with the team, I think it's been really important to mix in the low-hanging fruit with some of the more complex problems, because sometimes the complex problems take a long time to develop a pattern for. And if we can get some of those low-hanging fruit mixed in, we feel sort of successful and we want to keep going with our efforts. So I've been trying to get a mix of different things going in the group. And then also through the different talks we've had, we've been able to recruit folks from outside of web development. So we've had a designer join now and a mobile engineer. So we're kind of growing that effort as we go along. So the roadmap. I picked this picture for the roadmap because it's not just having a road, but also having a destination in mind. And so I definitely have a vision of where I want us to be at the end of 2013, and we're marching that direction. And then, of course, I have a vision that's much larger beyond that, but at least sort of we have this year's plan in mind. So things that we're kind of tackling this year are navigation in particular. We just rolled out a new navigation paradigm for the whole site, and we want to make sure that that experience is now optimized for everyone, keyboard navigation, screen readers, et cetera. And we want to make sure that our key forms on the site are following the best practices and standards. So we've actually documented what those forms should look like now in our UI pattern library, but then we're trying to get certain teams to adopt those patterns right now, or helping them do that work. We also have done work on the dialogue libraries, JavaScript libraries for dialogue overlays on the site. We've been working on select controls and different types of buttons and sliders. We're working actually on a slider control right now and an accessible autocomplete control. And what we call a ghost label, but essentially a placeholder shim that is accessible with some patterns and guidelines around that. So finally, I think the last step is to think iteratively about developing these features. So a lot of things we could get an easy win by just changing the markup structure slightly or by adding something to the CSS layer. And then we could go back later and then add on some of the rich internet functionality using JavaScript. And so trying to break these problems down where we can into smaller chunks. So I mentioned that we have the image alt audit that we did. And of course, now there's a chance that people could be checking in more images without alt attributes. And so what we're working on with another task force called the Developer Productivity Task Force here is to have actually a pre-commit hook in SVN that won't allow people to check in images without an alt attribute. So that's something we're going to try to mitigate going forward, and that's an iterative step for us. So I will show you a few of the other things we've been working on from our super secret UI patterns. So this is our form section in our UI patterns library. And we've done a lot of work around documenting how error states should be nested within labels and how the labels should be associated with their inputs. And then finally, one of the things that we looked at most recently was the select controls. The designers really want to have a very stylized select control, and including the drop-down that appears below the select control. And there was kind of an interesting progressive enhancement that folks started doing 5 or 6 years ago, where they took a select and then added some JavaScript on top of it and then rewrote it as an unordered list so they could do whatever styling they wanted, and then the two would talk to each other. We found that that just really wasn't good from a number of standpoints for us. One is a lot of folks were accessing our forms on a touch screen, even though it was on the website. And so that just wasn't working really well for that. It also lacked a lot of the richness of a native select control. So you get kind of an autocomplete type of functionality as you type in a select box, and it was definitely lacking that. So we decided to take a compromise where we figured out a way to style the control as it appears on the page, and it looks pretty just like the designers want it. But then from there, it's just a native select, and the menu comes out in whatever way that browser supports it. So let me go back to the top. So another example that we worked on is this notion of a split button. So the split button is essentially the left side clicks through to another page, and then the right side displays a list of related actions. And this was a paradigm that the designers really wanted to have kind of throughout the site. And initially, the implementation for this was essentially an anchor for the left side of the button, which is arguably appropriate. And then the right side was one of these empty href anchors. And then the list below was a div. So the first enhancement we did to this was just changing the markup structure to be buttons, anchor for the left side, button for the right side. If the left side is an inline action, then we use a button there as well. And then changing the list to a definition list. The second enhancement we did is these were originally implemented just using the hover pseudo class in CSS. And that basically made the sub options visible. They were display none previously. And that just wouldn't work from a keyboard at all. So we thought, well, we can get a little bit of a win for visual keyboard navigators if we also turn on the focus pseudo class so they can at least see that there's other stuff there. So we did that, and then finally we've now gone back in and added JavaScript on top of this. So essentially, I can hover, I can click, I can go from the keyboard. You can see we have like these nice focus states. And then I can hit enter to toggle that as well. So that was something we did sort of iteratively, but now I feel like the pattern is reasonably documented. So dialogues, this was another case of something we did iteratively. So the first thing we did was we just made sure that the markup had role of dialogue in the container surrounding the dialogue, and also that the title was labeled with a ARIA labeled by attribute. Then essentially we did a lot of work in the JavaScript layer. So this is an example where we're actually using tab index. So if we look at this, so we can see here we have a role of dialogue, and the tab index is -1. And what that allows us to do is then place focus on the container when it opens. So then someone using a screen reader is hearing, okay, this is a dialogue, the title is this, and now they can start tabbing from there. So the first tab stop is now the icon to close the dialogue, which is also labeled with text for assistive devices to read off that this is going to close the dialogue, and then they can continue tabbing through. So that's a non-modal dialogue. And then the modal dialogue, in addition to the other enhancements, we actually did focus trapping. So this basically gives keyboard navigators the same functionality that a mouse user is experiencing. So a mouse user, when they have this dialogue open, they shouldn't be able to interact with anything else on the page because it's all under an underlay. And we want the same effect for keyboard navigators. So as they move through, they're going to hit the end of this dialogue, and then the focus is going to cycle back through from the beginning. So they can basically only focus on elements that are inside that dialogue. All right, so that's all I've got to show you guys tonight. These are the sort of iterative things that we've done. This has been our journey thus far. We have a lot more places we want to go, but this was how we got started, sort of in stealth at the beginning and somewhat less stealth now. So I hope this has been helpful, and I'd love to hear any questions you guys have about our approach or any specific technologies. Please use the microphone as well if you can. Feel free to pass it around.
Hey there.
Hey.
I'm developing an interface, but the main interface isn't a website. It's mainly email.
Okay.
Do you have any thoughts on accessibility in email? Thanks.
In an HTML email or
Just a plain email.
just a plain email?
Yeah.
So I think in a text-based email, it's actually sometimes easier to be accessible because you have a lot less expression that you can do. And so typically just making sure that your calls to action, which are probably going to be links, right, that those are sort of prepended by text describing what you want them to do or what the expected outcome is when they click on that link. So, you know, go to the URL below to sign up for our course or something like that, so they understand what the purpose of that link is.
Just a follow-up. So there is an interface online, but the main interface is interaction with the email. Any thoughts on how to direct someone who needs accessibility to interact in that manner?
I'm not sure I'm totally clear on what you're describing. So
you have a product, right? And you discover it online via a
Okay.
web page.
Okay.
But the interaction with the product is actually through email. So you would take action by responding to an email, and that would make a call to the service. But the main interaction between the product is via email, because my target user doesn't have the time to go online and interact with a website. So they respond to the service through email.
Okay.
So if I have a user who needs accessibility, how do I prompt the user to interact with my service?
I think I would just try to make sure that the text of the email somewhere has an explanation of how to take the call to action. So basically say like, respond to this email to do blah, blah, blah. And then that should hopefully prompt them. Yeah.
Just wanted to ask you to share links or resources to the example that you showed.
To the UI library examples. So right now these are internal only tools, but
If there are stuff that you wrote on your blog, or I don't know, stuff that you use on a daily basis, like you use, I don't know, Firebug or stuff like that. So
okay.
for the examples with the tag index, for example, I wasn't even, I don't know this feature. That was first time for me. I'm not a Ninja front-end developer.
Yeah.
But where can I find this stuff?
So there's a really great resource site called WebAIM. They have a lot of WebAIM. They have a lot of articles, patterns documented, stuff like that. And then there are a lot of folks who are kind of into this who tend to blog on their own blogs or their company blogs about it. So if you're working on something, typically if you just Google accessible blah, you will actually find usually a fair number of patterns. So I recently was looking for an accessible slider widget and then found the Paciello group. They're a big consulting agency for accessibility, and they actually had several patterns documented that I could reference for best practices. Most of the patterns are not browser dependent. So most of the sort of native accessibility stuff is built into all the browsers via the standards. The way that assistive technologies interact with these standards is slightly different across each assistive technology. So depending on if you're talking about a screen reader, the browser screen reader combination might give you different feedback depending on the standards that they've implemented in the screen readers. But most of the basic stuff, most of the low-hanging fruit stuff I talked about would be the same across all the browsers.
Hello. I was wondering if you could talk briefly about the technical implementation of the focus trapping on the modal.
Yes, the focus trapping. So basically, I believe so Nicholas Zakas has a great article on this, by the way. He gives you like a very nice native JS implementation, but I'm basically looking at the focus in event and then basically seeing, I believe I'm checking the parent of that, and if the parent is not the dialogue, then I'm basically cycling back to the dialogue itself. So I'm just catching the next focus and placing it back onto the parent container.
I'm sure that I'm right that this is not a publicly accessible.
Yes, this is not publicly accessible, though there may be some revealing of these patterns at some point in the future, as yet not determined publicly.
Yeah, I tried typing it in, and it gave me too much network traffic to allow
Ah.
Error message, but totally useless, which is important for an error message.
Exactly. Exactly, yeah. So this is an internal tool. We call it Da Vinci, and the goal of the pattern library is to give a common language between designers and developers. So basically, designers can spec things based on what we call them in the pattern library. And then for developers, we actually have code samples for how to implement all of these widgets. So essentially, I mean, it's not just copy and paste. You need to kind of understand what's going on, but it gives a great head start to doing development. So education is an ongoing challenge for us. I think I have some vision around how we're going to do this in the future, but for right now, a lot of the education happens in review boards with developers. So essentially, all front-end code that gets developed here gets sent to a specific group of reviewers, of which I'm one of, and I tend to pick through things that I think might have accessibility implications and kind of give suggestions on those. And then again, I've written a couple of articles on particular problems and how I think we should approach them, and kind of distribute those internally, and then doing these different events. But I think, ultimately, it would be great to have all developers and QA and designers trained in these principles long term. So typically when we have something significant that we're rolling out, we have a few friends in the blind community or who use assistive technologies, and we'll say, hey, we're going to put you in this bucket test. Let us know what you think of this. And so we get some help that way. We get some validation that way. In terms of validating internally, I think as we're developing different features, and for developers who are thinking about these things, they might actually kind of write test cases for these to give to QA. So we do have QA validating a few things at this point, but definitely not to the extent that I'd love. All right. Thanks, everyone.